The Maxi Trial, when Sicily fought back. What if I told you that on December 16, 1987, a single courtroom verdict shook one of the most powerful criminal empires in the world? Picture this: Palermo, Sicily. A fortress-like bunker courtroom falls silent as judges prepare to deliver a decision that could either cripple the Sicilian Mafia or prove it was truly untouchable. 19 of the Mafia's most feared bosses, men who had ruled Sicily through violence and intimidation for decades, await their fate. They believed themselves beyond the reach of the law. Then the verdict is announced: life in prison. Not just for one boss, but for all 19. Hundreds of others face sentences that add up to more than 2,500 years. This was the Maxi Trial, and in that moment, the impossible became reality. The Mafia's reign of fear had been broken, or at least it appeared so. But when Italy's highest court upheld those convictions in 1992, the bosses didn't accept defeat. Instead, they declared war on the Italian state itself. To understand the Maxi Trial, you need to step back to the early 1980s. Sicily was drowning in blood. Judges, police chiefs, and politicians were gunned down in the streets. Ordinary citizens lived in constant fear, knowing that even speaking out against the Mafia could mean death. The Mafia wasn't just a criminal syndicate. It was a shadow government ruling through silence and intimidation. One man dared to challenge this system: Judge Rocco Chinnici. He believed that fighting Cosa Nostra couldn't depend on lone investigators. Too many had already been murdered. His idea was revolutionary: form a collective pool of magistrates who would share responsibility, protect one another, and pool intelligence. This became known as the anti-Mafia pool. After Chinnici was assassinated in 1983, Judge Antonino Caponetto took charge, bringing in two brilliant prosecutors, Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino. Together, they turned fragmented investigations into a united campaign against the Mafia's empire. For decades, the Mafia thrived because Italian law made it nearly impossible to convict top bosses. Unless prosecutors caught a boss committing a crime with his own hands, charges rarely stuck. Everyone knew the Godfathers ordered killings, but the justice system had no way to connect them directly to the crimes. That changed in 1982 after the assassination of General Carlo Alberto Dalla Chiesa, who had been sent to Sicily as the state's top anti-Mafia official. Within 100 days of his arrival, he, his wife, and his bodyguard were gunned down. The killings shocked Italy and forced Parliament to act. The result was the Rognoni La Torre law, named after a politician murdered earlier that same year. This law introduced Article 416 bis to the Italian Penal Code, making it a crime simply to belong to a mafia-type association. For the first time, prosecutors could hold mafia leaders accountable for benefiting from the organization's violence and intimidation, even if they hadn't personally pulled the trigger. Even more devastating for the Mafia, the law allowed the state to seize assets of convicted mafiosi: luxury homes, businesses, cars, and cash. For Cosa Nostra, money was everything. Striking at their wealth meant striking at their power. This law became the foundation of the Maxi Trial. Even with new laws, the Mafia's structure was still hidden. Investigators needed evidence to prove how it actually operated. In 1982, police officer Ninni Cassara compiled a groundbreaking report mapping links between Mafia families, businesses, and killings. It suggested Cosa Nostra wasn't just a loose network, but a centralized system. But reports weren't enough. The breakthrough came when Mafia insiders known as pentiti repentants began to talk. The most famous was Tommaso Buscetta, a former high-ranking boss. After his arrest and extradition, he agreed to testify to Judge Falcone. His revelations confirmed what investigators had long suspected. The Mafia had a pyramid structure, with a ruling council known as the cupola at the top. Buscetta's testimony, later supported by Salvatore Contorno, proved that the Mafia was a single unified organization. Orders for killings, extortion, and drug trafficking came from the top leadership. The myth that bosses were just ordinary businessmen was shattered. By the mid-1980s, prosecutors had the evidence, but they needed a secure place to hold such a massive trial. The old court buildings in Palermo were too vulnerable to mafia attacks, so the Italian state built a bunker courtroom made of reinforced concrete and steel next to Palermo's Ucciardone prison. It resembled a fortress, complete with armored doors, underground passageways, and space for hundreds of lawyers, journalists, guards, and nearly 500 defendants. On February 10, 1986, the Maxi Trial opened. Palermo woke up to a city under military guard. Helicopters patrolled the skies, soldiers lined the streets, and everyone knew this was no ordinary trial. Inside the bunker, behind reinforced glass, sat hundreds of defendants accused of extortion, drug trafficking, and dozens of murders. The scale was unprecedented. 475 people on trial at once. This was more than a legal case. It was Sicily's declaration that it would no longer live in fear. Over 349 hearings, the courtroom became a stage where the Mafia's secrets were finally laid bare. The most dramatic moments came when Buscetta testified. He described the cupola, the chain of command, and how orders were passed down. Across the courtroom, mafiosi like Pippo Calò shouted insults, mocking his betrayal, clinging to the code of silence. But Buscetta's testimony carried immense weight. He was one of them, and he was breaking the code. Judge Alfonso Giordano presided with calm authority, keeping order in a courtroom that might have descended into chaos. Prosecutors like Falcone presented meticulous evidence, tracing drug money from heroin routes in the U.S. back to Sicily, proving that every decision flowed from the Mafia's leadership. For the first time, the Mafia's invisible empire was made visible, and the Italian state dared to confront it head-on. As weeks turned into months, testimony from Tommaso Buscetta and other Mafia defectors painted a picture that could no longer be denied. The Mafia was not a vague underworld of shadowy figures. It was a structured hierarchy with leaders, soldiers, and a rigid chain of command. Every extortion, every drug shipment, every murder could be traced back to bosses who had long appeared untouchable. The trial was dismantling the myth of invincibility in real time. By the time prosecutors finished, there was no longer a question of whether the Mafia existed as an organized system. That was now beyond dispute. The real question was whether the Italian state had the courage to carry justice through to the very end. On December 16, 1987, that question was answered. After nearly 2 years of hearings and mountains of testimony, Judge Alfonso Giordano and his colleagues delivered the verdict inside Palermo's fortified bunker courtroom. Silence hung heavy as the sentences were read. 19 of Sicily's most powerful mafia bosses were condemned to life imprisonment. In total, 338 defendants were convicted, with combined prison sentences exceeding 2,600 years. Archival records from the Falcone Foundation count 346 convictions, reflecting differences in legal classification. Whether 338 or 346, the meaning was the same. For the first time in Italian history, the Mafia had been struck at its core, not just at its edges. Crowds outside the courthouse erupted, some in celebration, others in disbelief. For ordinary Sicilians who had lived for decades under the shadow of Cosa Nostra, the verdict was a sign that the state could finally stand taller than the men who had terrorized them. For the bosses behind reinforced glass, it was proof that the wall of silence had been breached. The myth of untouchability had been shattered in a single afternoon. Yet everyone knew this was not the end. Appeals were inevitable, and the Mafia still wielded enormous power on the streets. The first appeal came in 1990 before a court in Palermo. Some convictions were overturned, others reduced, and for a moment it seemed the Mafia might claw back its impunity. The entire trial hung in the balance. If the convictions collapsed, the Maxi Trial would be remembered as a bold but failed experiment. The final word, however, came from the Supreme Court of Cassation in Rome, Italy's highest court. On January 30th, 1992, under Judge Arnaldo Valente, the court delivered its ruling. The convictions stood. Sentences cut during the appeal were reinstated, and the legal foundation of Article 416 bis, the law that made belonging to a mafia association a crime, was fully validated. Most importantly, the court confirmed the so-called Buscetta theorem, that Cosa Nostra was not a collection of scattered gangs, but a single centralized organization governed by a ruling commission. For prosecutors Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, it was vindication. For Sicily, it was proof that the Mafia could be confronted with the law. The Mafia had lost, not just in Palermo, but at the highest level of Italian justice. Yet victory carried a shadow. Everyone knew Cosa Nostra would not accept defeat quietly. The only question was when and how it would strike back. The Supreme Court's decision in January 1992 marked the Mafia's greatest legal defeat. It also triggered one of the bloodiest years in modern Italian history. On March 12, 1992, Salvo Lima, a Christian Democrat politician from Sicily, long seen as the Mafia's link to Rome, was gunned down. For years, Lima had been a guarantor of political protection. His assassination was both punishment and warning. The Mafia felt betrayed, and anyone who failed to shield them from justice would pay the price. On March 12, 1992, Salvo Lima, a Christian Democrat politician from Sicily, long seen as the Mafia's link to Rome, was gunned down. For years, Lima had been a guarantor of political protection. His assassination was both punishment and warning. The Mafia felt betrayed, and anyone who failed to shield them from justice would pay the price. The true horror came just weeks later. On May 23, 1992, Giovanni Falcone returned to Palermo with his wife Francesca Morvillo and his police escort. As his convoy drove past the town of Capaci, a massive bomb buried beneath the highway exploded by remote control. Falcone, his wife, and 3 bodyguards were killed instantly. The explosion ripped open the road and shocked the world. Less than 2 months later, on July 19, 1992, Paolo Borsellino visited his mother's home in Palermo. As he arrived, a car packed with explosives detonated, killing him and 5 members of his escort. The 2 magistrates who had led the fight against Cosa Nostra were murdered within 57 days of each other. These were not random acts of revenge. They were deliberate attacks designed to terrorize the state and prove the Mafia's strength despite courtroom defeats. But the strategy backfired. Millions of Italians poured into the streets, outraged and grieving. Citizens who had once been too afraid to speak now demanded action. The murders of Falcone and Borsellino became a national turning point. Silence was no longer possible. The Mafia's ferocity had awakened an entire country. Far from breaking the state, the assassinations forced a national reckoning. Within months, Italy reorganized its fight against organized crime. The Direzione Investigativa Anti-Mafia, DIA, created in 1991, expanded dramatically, bringing together police, carabinieri, and financial investigators under a single command. Alongside it, the Direzione Nazionale Anti-Mafia, DNA, was established, giving prosecutors across Italy a coordinated national strategy. The results were immediate. On January 15, 1993, police captured Salvatore Toto Riina, the Mafia's boss of bosses, who had ordered the murders of Falcone and Borsellino. His arrest after decades in hiding was a seismic moment. Crowds in Palermo filled the streets, celebrating the fall of the man who had terrorized Sicily for so long. His successor, Bernardo Provenzano, would evade capture for more than a decade, running Cosa Nostra through handwritten notes smuggled between hideouts. He was finally arrested in 2006, ending another era of mafia leadership. For the first time, Italy had built a permanent national system to fight organized crime. The sacrifices of 1992 had forced the state to learn, adapt, and strike back. Decades later, the Maxi Trial remains a turning point, not only in Italy, but worldwide. Legally, it cemented Article 416 bis as one of the strongest tools against organized crime. By criminalizing mafia association itself, prosecutors could hold leaders accountable for the violence and intimidation they ordered, even if they never committed the acts personally. Just as importantly, the law's power to seize mafia assets, luxury villas, businesses, farmland, cut into the financial lifeblood of Cosa Nostra. Culturally, the trial shattered the code of silence. Ordinary Sicilians, long trapped under omertà, saw that the mafia could be named, prosecuted, and punished. Civil society movements grew. Schools began teaching about Falcone and Borsellino. Anti-Mafia associations spread across Sicily. Speaking out was no longer unthinkable. Internationally, the trial became a model. Its use of cooperating witnesses influenced modern witness protection systems. Its handling of hundreds of defendants in a single proceeding showed that even vast criminal conspiracies could be managed within the rule of law. Prosecutors across the world studied Palermo's example when designing strategies against cartels, gangs, and transnational networks. Above all, the Maxi Trial proved that an empire of fear could be brought into the light of justice. Even today, the memory of 1992 remains alive in Sicily. Each May and July, thousands march to honor Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino. Banners read, "They did not kill them. Their ideas walk on our legs." The Falcone Foundation, created by Giovanni's sister, preserves the trial's records and brings its lessons into schools, ensuring that the sacrifices of 1987 and 1992 are never forgotten. The bunker courtroom itself still stands in Palermo. Once a fortress against intimidation, it is now a civic symbol, visited by students, citizens, and leaders. Where the mafia once sought to silence the state left behind a monument to resilience. It was the day the mafia fell from the shadows into the light of justice. And while the cost was terrible, the lives of Falcone, Borsellino, and so many others, their legacy endures as proof that no empire built on fear is beyond the reach of law.